going to truck through these notes because that's the only way I can do this in 15 minutes. Those who know me personally know that's why that has to happen. I do want to go on record that with my American husband, we protested the Iraq War in Newton, Kansas, back when it started. So I just needed to go on. Very good. And that, of course, I am shaped by my faith community, and of course the biblical story is behind that. And I want to go over it very briefly because it will explain why I want the government of Canada to do what I think they should do. In my own faith communities and other Christian communities as well, we're in the season of Epiphany. And of course, usually we focus on the three gifts that were brought to Jesus by strangers from the East. Now, the deep meaning of this story is that already at the birth of Jesus, he was a threat to King Herod, and in fact, he was so threatened that he had all the baby boys of Bethlehem put to death. Now, God protected the newborn Jesus by warning the father in a dream, and they fled to Egypt as refugees. Jesus carried the same situation into his adulthood, and in his work of announcing God's kingdom, he showed compassion by healing the sick. He explained by story who God and his kingdom are, and he called people of his own faith hypocrites who did not live true to the Jewish faith. He told them to repent. He met vulnerable people with compassion. His one time of rage that we have recorded is when he chased the money changers out of the temple who were ripping off the pilgrims who came yearly to Jerusalem. Now, this sets us, of course, on a course of advocacy, which we take seriously. When religion has lost its way and becomes corrupted, we have to stand against it. Now, Jesus' following grew larger and larger, and he was so popular because he was just so good. And the religious leaders conspired to kill him, knowing they had no way to compete with this man. As he faced his ultimate death, he told his followers not to fight back, that God was in control. Now, as he was dying on the cross, he prayed, "God forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now, the Apostle Peter continued that, and he said, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly, or God, in other words. So, nonviolence, as the example of Jesus during his torturous death, is the model that we follow. And of course, there are Muslim parallels that I'm not adequate in explaining, but as the prophet went back to Mecca, he could have slaughtered them all. He was powerful enough to do them, and he forgave them instead. So there's parallel stories there as well. Now, not only do I believe that it is right ethically to love your enemies and to repay evil with good, I also believe it's the most effective. Now, we have examples like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King. We have a wonderful Liberian women's story on how they got the Civil War stopped, and it was a nonviolent movement. Very simplistically, and this is I will do lots of simplistic things. This is the worst. If everyone had ignored ISIS' first aggression, they wouldn't have any way to recruit new recruits, right? Every time there's aggression, they have reason to recruit more, and so it just escalates. So the more bombs fall, the more reason ISIS has to exist and to recruit. Now, I'm an idealist. It's how I was shaped. But I was interested, my closest neighbor is a Syrian. She's been here 3 years. She's a refugee claimant. And one day she was telling me what happened in 2011 before she came here. And her husband sat down with the protesters and freedom fighters. And their main point to those people was, if you take up arms, there are going to be millions and millions of Syrians that die. If you do not take up any arms at all, if you do a nonviolent protest, there may be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands killed, but eventually the world will not put up with innocent people with arms being killed that much. But if everybody's fighting, anyway. So that's what she had put to the protesters, and of course they didn't listen to her and her husband. It's something to think about. I think we've had a lot of direction already. It's important to be able to respond well as Canadians to the crisis with ISIS. We need to understand the background. Now, this is some impressions I've had from reading. I can't document it all. It's just things that come together. But one long-term reason that we're in the situation we are is because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and we've talked about colonialism, in lots of ways, that Islam took a real dip in its own self-understanding. And we have to think of Christian parallels as this as well. Things happen within our spirits when we think that being the most powerful also makes us the most right. And when you put those together, and then you lose your power, then you have to rethink things, and you have a lot of tension, and you have a lot of crisis and self-identity issues that come up because of that. So it's just something to think about, and I think it's crucial in this context. I just got a report from one of the elders within the Mennonite Church who was visiting in Europe just during the Paris attacks. He was visiting European educational institutions, both Christian and Muslim. And it was interesting that of the participants that he visited with, that the majority of those said that the reason that ISIS exists, would agree with your analysis, was because of the military interventions in the Gulf Wars and Afghanistan over the last couple of decades. Now, that's a relief to me to know that at least we are not saying that Islam is a violent religion and that's why it's happening. So, at least in that context, they had that kind of perspective. Now, he went on to add that he felt a lot of ISIS is about revenge. It doesn't come out of a total ideology, it's coming out of a backlash against the violence that they feel the West has done to them. So you have the Iraq War, as she talked about, is revenge against 9/11, and so it goes on, the revenge and cycles of violence. Now, there's an article, I don't know what you think of Karen Armstrong. She lets me think anyway, and gives me things to think about. She wrote an article called "There is Nothing in Islam That is More Violent Than Christianity." And it gives a lot of perspective. She said that until 1700, nobody thought of separating religion. It permeated the whole of life, and still people who have not had our particular modernization find that an arbitrary distinction. Now, I lived in Africa, and of course there's no spiritual, political distinction. Because matters like justice, the plight of the poor, the suffering, these are political questions, but they are also matters of sacred import. So Jesus would have had no time for people who said their prayers and neglected the plight of the needy or the oppressed. But we sort of separated it off. That separation was important for us. In many ways, the separation was good for religion because it freed it from the violence of government. Then religion wasn't tied to political power. Now, to sum it up, all civilization is rooted in violence. That is so for the vast majority of the history of civilization. Without the oppression of people by aristocracy, we would have never have had the science and arts upon which we depend. Cities were built on their taxes, so it was free for some, but not for others. So it is still like that today. But there were always people who stood up and said, this is wrong. And that has been as much a part of Christianity, that has been as much a part of religion as any crusade or jihad. So people standing up and protesting and saying this is not right. Now, Armstrong would also say that our strong Western secular societies have created the fundamentalism we now have. I see that the weaknesses of Western society can spawn fundamentalism. And that's one of Armstrong's major points. Western society, individualism, lack of working toward common good, lack of connection with neighbors, weakness of nuclear family, breakdown of family, all of that makes a very negative society, which could be very different if it was matched with religious values. Because often when we lose religious values, there's these breakdowns. Now, I want to quote from a Jewish rabbi who wrote a book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. I have not finished this book, but it is well worth a read. I want to just quote this. Others have shown how the rich repertoire of religious ethics with its dimensions of respect for authority, loyalty, and a sense of the sacred furnish a more comprehensive or thick morality than the relatively pared down features of secular ethics based on fairness and the avoidance of harm. It is not that religious people are more moral than their secular counterparts, but rather that their moralities tend to have a thicker and richer texture, binding groups together, not merely regulating the encounters of randomly interacting individuals. So faith binds people together. Another point that Sachs makes in his book is that the litmus test of whether a person or group is living faithfully in relation to God in one of the three Abrahamic faiths is whether they are welcoming the stranger. Once they block out the stranger, it is clear they are no longer representative of their faith. Syria is one of the best examples of this because they welcomed everybody. They welcomed the Palestinians, they welcomed the Syrians, the Iraqis, and they welcomed the Somalis, and there's people in Edmonton that have all been welcomed by Syria. One way that we could tell our Canadian government is that Trudeau should do the opposite of what Donald Trump is doing. And of course, Trump says to keep out all Syrian refugees. I think we in Canada are doing a wonderful job and it's a good sign that we're on a right track. Since elections, we are more inclusive religiously, and we have less anti-Muslim sentiment, and we can all reassure Muslims that we happen to meet or intentionally meet, that we are okay. I think we can encourage our government to do one thing, and that's a basic that I live with. The most important is that we slow down the military aggression that Canada has against ISIS. I think it's our best national security plan. My son lives in Mali, where there's been attacks, and of course it's always targeting French nationals. Why? Because the French went after Al-Qaeda in Mali. And so it's a simple thing. Our best protection would be not to be aggressive, and then they don't have any revenge to take on us. One thing I want us to think about is that we here in Alberta, this is David Goa that explained this to me in a presentation, that there's probably about 200 people that have left Alberta to go join terrorist groups of some kind. And to think about what kind of a society we live in. And one thing that we need to think about is that our university, our society is very secular. We don't allow a lot of faith discussion in public debate and public discussion. And it's we have a growing religious identity in our country because new immigrants are coming with large families, and we think, no, this is constantly going to be more and more secular, and the stats don't give that out. So I think we need to accept the fact that we have a pluralistic religious society, and we can be tolerant. We have a good interfaith movement in Edmonton already, and we really can work at this. But then young people who are trying to form their identity, there's a story of a young Palestinian woman who lived her whole life in Vancouver, but at one point, she was 14-year-old, a very vulnerable age, she heard that the Canadian government was pro-Israeli and against the Palestinians. And the end of her story is that she eventually went to join ISIS. Why did she go? Not because she wasn't educated or didn't have a good family. There was a disconnect between this country that she loved, and those are the things that we need to understand. The other thing I want to leave with you is that the Syrians that I have met, and I hope in question and answer time, I didn't know what questions to answer in terms of how to sponsor or how to help people come, so please let's ask those good questions in the question and answer time. But what I want us to think about is that Syrians are arriving. I know a lot of them. They're very, very excited about being here. They're excited to be safe. But oh my goodness, they lost a wonderful way of life and they lost a wonderful civilization. And that civilization is being sold off to museums and it's being destroyed. But the way of life that the Syrians had is something that really we could learn from. And they were tolerant religiously. They were highly educated. They were strong in family. They were cohesive. And the stories are just amazing in terms of the kind of world. I haven't met anybody from Syria that visited Syria that didn't say that Syria was the best place in the world that I ever visited. And so if you have a chance to welcome Syrians, please also ask them about their life and what it was like before they ended up in a refugee camp. Because they really, they have lost so much. And we at least can give them, the permission to grieve that they did lose an awful lot. Thank you so much.